On behalf of the State Library of Louisiana and the Louisiana Center for the Book, I'd like to thank you for joining us today as we honor John Barry, the recipient of the 2020 Louisiana Writer Award. Presented annually, the Louisiana Writer Award recognizes the extraordinary contributions of the state's literary heritage exemplified by an author's body of work. John M. Barry is a prize-winning and New York Times best-selling author whose books have won multiple awards. The National Academies of Sciences named his 2004 book, The Great Influenza, The Story of the Deadliest Pandemic in History, a study of the 1918 pandemic, the year's outstanding book on science or medicine. His earlier book, Rising Tide, The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 and How It Changed America, won the Francis Parkman Prize of the Society of American Historians for the year's Best Book of American History, and in 2005, the New York Public Library named it one of the 50 best books in the preceding 50 years. His latest book is Roger Williams and the Creation of the American Soul, Church, State, and the Birth of a Liberty, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and a winner of the New England Society Book Award. In 2004, he began working with the National Academies and several federal government entities on influenza preparedness and response, and he was a member of the original team which developed plans for mitigating a pandemic in the time before a vaccine becomes available. Both the Bush and Obama administrations have sought his advice on influenza preparedness and response, and he continues his activity in this area. After Hurricane Katrina, the Louisiana congressional delegation asked him to chair a bipartisan working group on flood protection, and he served on the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority East, overseeing levee districts in metropolitan New Orleans, as well as on the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. In 2004, GQ named Rising Tide one of the 9 pieces of writing essential to understanding America. His first book, The Ambition and the Power, A True Story of Washington, was cited by the New York Times as one of the 11 best books ever written about Washington and the Congress. His second book, The Transformed Cell, Unlocking the Mysteries of Cancer, co-authored with Dr. Steven Rosenberg, was published in 12 languages. And a story about football he wrote was selected for inclusion in an anthology of the best football writing of all time, published in 2006 by Sports Illustrated. He is co-originator of what is now called the Bywater Institute, a Tulane University center dedicated to comprehensive river research. His articles have appeared in such scientific journals as Nature and Journal of Infectious Diseases, as well as in lay publications ranging from Sports Illustrated to Politico, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Fortune, Time, Newsweek, and Esquire. A frequent guest on every broadcast network in the U.S., he has appeared on such shows as NBC's Meet the Press, ABC's World News Tonight, and NPR's All Things Considered, and on such foreign media as the BBC and Al Jazeera. He has also served as a consultant for Sony Pictures and contributed to award-winning television documentaries. Before becoming a writer, Barry coached football at the high school and college levels. Currently, distinguished scholar at Tulane's Bywater Institute and a professor at the Tulane School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine, he lives in New Orleans. Interviewing John today will be Robert Mann. Robert is the Manship Chair in Journalism at the Manship School of Mass Communication at Louisiana State University, and also a board member of the Louisiana Library and Book Festival Foundation, a co-sponsor for today's event. The Louisiana Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana is proud to present the recipient of the 2020 Louisiana Writer Award, John M. Barry.
John, first of all, congratulations on a well-deserved and long overdue recognition for your tremendous writing over the years.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
And I'm honored to be the person interviewing you today. And I want to start just to...
That may be overdoing it. Kind of you to say.
I want to start by just establishing a little bit of biographical information about you and your writing. I understand that you were once a football coach, and you transitioned to the writer you are today. So tell us about how a football coach becomes a writer.
Well, yeah, when I was a kid, I had three things that interested me. One was writing, the other was medical research, and I guess the third, starting when I was about 12 or 13, was football. Uh, I never intended to make a career out of football. I loved the game. When I was in high school, I was drawing up plays and inventing offenses. Uh, a high school coach actually used to send me to scout other teams. As a matter of fact, college, I sat on the bench, and it was pretty frustrating. I tell people I sat on the bench on a bad team in a weak league. If I had played on a bad team in a weak league, or sat on the bench on a good team in a good league or something like that, it might not have hurt so much. But sitting on a bad team in a weak league, it's left a bad taste in my mouth. And I did go to grad school in history, and dropped out and coached for a few years. And a lot of people in New Orleans think my greatest achievement was to be a lowly member of the staff at Tulane when they beat LSU for the first time in 25 years. And, back in 1973, we beat them 14-0. We stuffed them. They were an Orange Bowl LSU team. A few years later, LSU started to have some bad seasons, or at least for LSU, bad seasons. But that was their only other loss that year, was to number 1 Alabama. And to us, we were ranked as high as number 11. But again, I never expected to spend my life as a football coach. And after Tulane, I did become a head high school coach. I wanted to end my year as a head coach, end my career in football as a head coach. So,
Were you writing during that time?
yeah, I was. In fact, it's funny. I went to Northern Ireland in the spring of 1973, which was things were pretty hot then. The troubles, civil rights, Protestant versus Catholic. There was, an ongoing guerrilla war, and came back from Northern Ireland and came to Tulane from a very different situation, essentially a war zone, to Tulane. Of course, with LSU, that was a bit of a war too.
Mm-hmm. So tell me what, in your home growing up, what was your love of reading and writing something that was just innate in you, or did your parents encourage this in some way that introduced you to a new world, or how did that happen?
Well, my parents were certainly supportive of it. It just more or less came naturally. I never really thought about it. My number one desire was always to be a writer. As I said, second was do medical research. I actually was one of those kids, had sort of a lab in their own home. I had petri dishes, made my own medium, grew bacteria. I remember the moment at which I said, you know what, I'm not doing research, I'm going to be a writer. That was, I had been playing with E. coli, which, can kill you, but is a generally fairly mild microorganism. And I didn't think that was exciting enough. I guess I was 12 or 13, and I rode away to the American Bacteriological Supply House in Washington, D.C., and asked for Staphylococcus aureus, which is a very dangerous microorganism. And they sent it to me. I mean, today, if you did that, you would have the, National Security Agency, the CIA, everybody would come down on you. And I was growing that and so forth in the house. I figured I'd play around with it and maybe do so. Anyway, I went away to camp, and it came dehydrated in a vial. I hadn't used all of it, so I put it in the freezer so I could start growing it again when I came back from camp. And when I came back, I opened the freezer. I asked my parents, "Where's my Staph aureus?" And we had a family friend who was a doctor who had been over for dinner or something, and he said, "Well, what's John doing?" Or maybe they bragged. They said, "Oh, he's got this bacteria in the freezer," and so forth. At any rate, they threw it out, and I was furious. I mean, I was really furious. You know how mad a 13-year-old can get. I'm still mad about it. Still, I said, "The heck with this. I'm abandoning that and going to be a writer."
I'm sure they were happy you decided to go the writing route, huh?
I guess. I had what was, it's now an antique microscope. I actually, here in my office, it's a beautiful, got bronze on it. At the time I bought it used when I was a kid, saved up all my money. When it was made, it was a state-of-the-art microscope. Though already 50 years old then, now 100 or so years old, more than that probably. And it's really quite attractive. That's about the only remnant from my days as a researcher.
So I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I do think it might be appropriate to just talk for a minute. I want to come back to it and explore this a little bit more with you. But the Great Influenza, I guess, is the time when you were, or did you marry your love of writing with your love of medical research before that, or was that sort of the culmination of those two desires?
Well, it was neither. It was really an accident. It's kind of a long story how I got into that book, but I never intended to write that book, actually. I was going to expand Chapter 10 in Rising Tide, which is about the home front during World War I, and culminating in events of 1919, which is one of the, I think, most interesting and important years in American history. You had race riots in cities. You had a virtual race war in Elaine, Arkansas, or more a slaughter of African Americans. You had labor strikes. You had, a general strike in Seattle, a police strike in Boston, an attempted assassination of the Attorney General of the United States, Red Scare, and also J.P. Morgan for that matter. There was a lot going on. And the way I conceived of that book, I knew exactly how I wanted to proceed. And I figured it was going to take me at least 7 years and maybe longer than that to write. I live off my advance, that you get for a book. And a book that's going to take 7 to 10 years to live half decently, you say it all at once, that's a lot of money in an advance. That book wasn't going to get an advance, anything like that. So I thought I could do a book on the influenza pandemic, and that would subsidize my research onto a larger book. I thought the influenza book I could really do in a very short period of time, probably 2 years. And I gave a draft proposal to my agent, and then I told him I didn't want to write the book, and to forget about it, not to show it to anybody. But he did. And my editor now made an offer for it, which seemed like a lot of money for a book I could write in 2 years. I accepted it. It's actually probably about the only thing I've ever written for the money. And at least I decided to write it for the money. And it was a disaster because it didn't take me 2 years, it took me 7 years. And the same amount of money divided by 2 is not a lot of money when you divide it by 7. And for the first 5.5 years, I regretted every day that I had accepted agreed to write the book. I hated it. I wanted to throw it out the window. It wasn't working. Just wasn't working. But all of a sudden, it did come together. In the last 1.5 years, I was very happy that I'd started on it, and obviously, I'm happy with what's happened since. But it was a hard 5.5 years. And as after I finished my first, I was a journalist for a while. I went to history, grad school, thought I'd be a history professor, dropped out, coached football, became a journalist, finished my first book, which was about politics. And I was covered Washington politics and economic policy. And after I finished that book, my editor offered me what seemed like a lot of money to write a biography of Jimmy Carter. And I turned it down as I told him, if I'm going to write, I didn't want to spend 5 years of my life or more thinking about Jimmy Carter. I said, if I'm going to be writing about something I really don't want to do, then I may as well have a job. That was at a time when you could actually have jobs in journalism. It's not so anymore. It's a long time ago. And anyway, I didn't do that book. I went on to write other books that I felt more passionately about. So as I say, the influenza book started out as the only thing I ever agreed to do for the money. Went through hell doing it. But as repeating myself, it did come together, and obviously I'm glad I did it.
Well, when I was reading that book, I kept thinking to myself, if I didn't know you, and I knew you weren't a medical doctor, I knew you weren't a medical researcher, but if I didn't know who you were, I would have easily believed that that's what you were, because you're.
You know me too well. You thought I was a football coach. I was probably too dumb to do that, to write that stuff.
No, it was written with the kind of deep knowledge that you would expect from a medical researcher who knew a lot about writing. It wasn't superficial at all, but it also wasn't impenetrable. It was just the perfect balance of the two, and it's really just a magnificent book.
Well, thanks. The second book I wrote, which had a lot to do with that, I co-authored that with Steve Rosenberg. I ghosted it. It's really Steve's book. It's called The Transformed Cell: Unlocking the Mysteries of Cancer. He is the chief of the surgery branch at the National Cancer Institute. And he pioneered immunotherapy, came up with the first immunotherapy drugs, and did the first approved gene therapy experiments in the world. So, and I was in his lab every single day for 13 months. And without that experience, it would have been, the influenza book would have been a very, very different book. For one thing, I got a very good basic understanding of immunology. And, also the research process. I got a pretty good understanding of what goes on just watching his lab, which is one of the most productive cancer research labs in the world, without a doubt. So I owe a lot to Steve Rosenberg.
So I want to, if we can, if you'll indulge me, I'd like, I find the most interesting parts of interviews of writers are the times when they just discuss their methods, their research methods, their writing methods, their environment, and all that. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to walk you through just some basic questions about how you do your work. And I guess the first one is just, how do you decide on a topic for a book? You've already talked a little bit about how you landed on The Great Influenza and other books, but what's your process for thinking about what am I going to spend the next 2 to 7 years working on?
Well, number one, you really want to do it. You're going to spend that much time essentially by yourself. You better be passionate about what you're taking on. And, so I haven't written anything else for the money. And lots of times there's not a lot of money there either. So, I'm fortunately doing okay now, but, there's there have definitely been some hard times. To some extent, it's maybe opportunity presents itself for a particular subject that you have that maybe other people don't have. So that may be a factor, but it's primarily what you're most passionate about. The book that I'm best known for in Louisiana, I guess, is pretty clearly Rising Tide. And I was trying to write a novel in New Orleans in 1977 when the 50th anniversary of the 27 flood occurred. I was writing a sports column for the Vieux Carré Courier, which is sort of a precursor to Gambit. And the owner of that paper, Phil Carter, from Greenville, Mississippi, ran a special issue on the 27 flood with some great photographs. It's the first time I had ever heard of it I grew up in Rhode Island. So, I hear a lot about that history in Rhode Island. When I finished the book I just referred to with Steve Rosenberg on cancer research, it just, the idea of writing about that flood just kind of bubbled up. I have no idea where it came from. It's 20 years after I saw those photographs. It's not like I spent 20 years thinking, I want to write a book about the Mississippi River in the 1927 flood. But it just kind of sort of came to me. I have no idea why. But I did want to pursue it. I recall that I told my agent about the idea. He said, I'd never get an advance for that book that would make it allow me to write it. I then called my editor, or the editor of my first book, and told him about it. And he thought that he could guarantee that I'd get a minimum amount, which was enough to send me down to New Orleans to do research. It was a pretty interesting book proposal. That result, that was a real passion. Then came a collection, then came the influenza book, then came a book about the history of the idea of separation of church and state. Definitely a book I really cared about. And in fact, I think that book's my most important book, including the influenza book, although it probably sold less than any other book that I've written. I should plug it. It's called Roger Williams. The creation of the American soul, church, state, and the Roger Williams, and the creation of the American soul, church, state, and the birth of liberty. I think that's, as I said, I really think that's my best book, and certainly my least successful in terms of sales. That I cared about a lot. And then came a book that I was working on, hasn't come out, and that was about the Louisiana coast, will be, and everything that's gone into making the coast a disaster. And that book starts more than 2,000 miles upriver on the Missouri. And I put that aside now for a book. I'm now working on a book on COVID-19. Kind of obvious for me to do that.
Yeah. So let's maybe you can walk us through any one of your books. But when you decided, okay, this is what I'm going to write about, and you signed the contract, and you're given the go ahead. What do you do? What do you start doing? How do you do the research?
Well, they're all histories with the exception of what I'm doing right now. Uh, and so I start going to archives.
Mhm.
Uh, I still have a place in DC, although without a doubt, I spend most of the year in New Orleans. Uh, I justify the DC place because of the National Archives and the Library of Congress. Uh, I spend a lot of time in the National Archives. Very little of that material is online. Some of it is. You know, and certainly when I was originally started researching basically everything I've written, almost none of it, anything was online. There's a lot of material that is available online now, even including some primary sources. But if you're in a, but not that much, and again, very little that's in the National Archives, particularly as you go further back. Other than the Revolutionary War stuff, a lot of that material is available online, but I haven't written them in that period. I've gone either earlier, the Roger Williams book is 1600s. Of course, that's not in the National Archives. That is up in New England mostly. A lot of that stuff actually has been printed and is available online now. It wasn't when I did the book. So you just read through, old letters and old documents. I start a book, I have a pretty clear idea of the narrative line. Sometimes that changes, not always. Um, and I have a pretty clear idea of the main figures I want to write about. Sometimes that changes, not always. And I usually like to finish my research before I start writing. That's pretty much always been the case. The book that I put aside, which was about the coast, was the first time that I was ever a player in my own book, and that's because of the law when I was on the levee board, the lawsuit against 97 oil companies for coastal land loss. I was the architect of that lawsuit. So at the last part of the book would have involved the industry's role in the coastal destruction, but the book was by no means entirely about that. So it's one step after another. It can be a very tedious process. A lot of times you spend days in the archives going through material and getting very frustrated, not finding a single thing of any interest, much less that you might quote in a book. On rare occasions, you find something that is very valuable and you feel pretty good.
What's your writing environment? Where do you do most of your writing?
Well, in New Orleans, Tulane has been very kind and has provided an office to me. I've got a very nice title. It's the School of Public Health. I also have a tremendous view of the Mississippi River, one of the best views of the river in the city, although there are a lot of good ones. And that's where I have been really since quite a while. Pretty close to 20 years almost at this point, I guess. Um, and then I'm speaking to you right now from my office in DC, which is in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood of DC, where actually to finish my first book, I had left my job as a Washington journalist, and I was told I had to get out of the office where I had been working as a journalist. And this is in 1988 and Labor Day. And I had a friend who large house in this area. And I asked him if I could rent space in his office. I didn't have time. I was really on a tight deadline. Didn't have time to search for space. I said I'd be there for 3 months. I'll pay you in advance. And that was Labor Day 1988. I moved in. I'm still here.
So, what's your day like when you're writing? Do you have a word count? Do you start early and knock off at lunch, or how do you like? What's your routine?
Uh, I don't work nearly. I'm not as productive as I wish. I'll tell you. Probably the only piece of advice I ever got from a writer's magazine that I found useful was to use a chess clock. And that was to, how those work. You have 2 plungers and so forth, and your time doesn't count when the other, and it said, set a certain amount of time each day that you are going to sit at your desk and stare at your typewriter or now a computer and don't move. And if you move, talk on the telephone, get a cup of coffee, you press the chess clock down so your time doesn't count. And the idea was that out of pure boredom, eventually you would write something. And that was very useful in helping me discipline myself to write. And I tried to get that ingrained in my head. And every now and then I do still take the chess clock out. I mean, right now I'm doing research, so that doesn't apply. It's much easier to do research, hour after hour than it is to actually write hour after hour. I can't write hour after hour. It doesn't work except in very rare occasions.
Yeah, I don't think people understand just how much a slog the writing part is, and how disciplined you really have to be, and how you have to reset your expectations for what you're going to produce day after day.
Yeah, Red Smith's famous line, I'm sure you're familiar with it. Writing's easy. All I have to do is sit at the typewriter and open a vein.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a for me, and I suspect for you and every other writer who writes, is you really can't sit down and say, today I'm going to write a book. You've got to say, today I'm going to write part of a chapter, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then I used to have over my desk, I did kind of get this ingrained in my head, so it's not above my desk anymore. A couple of pieces of advice. And the most important were, what are you trying to say? Say it. That's number one, because I think key to decent writing is you want to be clear about what you're trying to get across. Now, you can be very subtle in that, very nuanced. It may not be clear to everyone, but you need to know what you're trying to say. And what you're trying, with the sensibility that you're trying to create. So what are you trying to say? Say it. If I get stuck on something, that helps. Then another thing that I think is very important and probably useful, not just for a writer, but just 2 words. So what? Well, I mean, that's an important question. It's kind of like a crossword puzzle. It works in many different directions. So what? I mean, that is what you're doing important? Is what you're trying to say important? If it isn't, why are you doing it? Why are you wasting your time on it? It also, if you ask yourself, so what, it's not only works in a way of, leading you to something to do, spend your time on something more important than otherwise, but it also forces you to think about the implications of what you're writing about or looking at, and can be a very, very creative tool. I think just those 2 words, so what, can be enormously important and the creative process and the writing process, and really almost in anything that you do. It's not just a question of writing. You can apply those two words.
When you have trouble answering that question, or when you just hit a brick wall, are you more apt to throw it all out and start over again, or are you more apt to just keep massaging what you already have on paper?
I probably tend to rework stuff more than throw stuff out, but I may think about stuff, but then certainly not to say that I never throw stuff out. But before I put something down, I've usually have thought about it. So I'm not putting down really random thoughts. There is a process, but I do plenty of discarding.
Do you work from an outline? Do you outline your chapters?
And I do not do that. No. I have, you write a book proposal but once that's done, and the proposal process is, you're familiar, I'm sure, but viewers may not be. That's what you use to sell a book. So you don't just go to a publisher and say, I'd like to write a book on an X subject. You have to explain exactly how you're going to approach that subject. But that aside, and one of the reasons the influenza book gave me so much trouble was because I hadn't really gone through that process. As I said, I drafted the proposal as an idea, and then I said, I don't want to write that book, and told my agent, don't show it to anybody. But as I said earlier, he did. Had I done my usual due diligence on the proposal, I would have known much better what was involved, what the difficulties were going to be, and frankly, I probably wouldn't have written the book. So I guess that's a good thing. So, I would have done something else. Maybe it would have worked. Maybe it wouldn't have. So in terms of, sometimes I go very, very, very slowly. Like right now, as I said, I'm writing a book on COVID-19, but I'm certainly going to write a chapter on 1918. And you would think that is something that I could just rip right through the whole chapter in a day and a half and produce 25 or 30 pages. That was, I've spent days on, more than days. And, I've written about 5 pages. Because it's not a question of condensing a 500-page or 450-page book, I guess, however many pages the influence of it. It's not a question of condensing it into a chapter. You have to completely rethink it and rethink what you want to write about as a precursor to a book on COVID-19. It's taken me forever, and it should have. One would think it would only take me a matter of a few days, but unfortunately, no.
Have you learned anything, or maybe that's a silly question. What have you learned this year from the pandemic that you would have either added to your book or influenced the way you wrote about the great influenza of 1918?
Well, I'm not sure that I've learned anything that would have changed what I wrote in the influenza book. In fact, I think one of the reasons it came back to life this year was because really the afterward seemed so prescient. Some of the things I wrote in there seem so relevant to what's happening today in terms of the politics, in terms of what needs to be done to take care of this thing or get it back in a box.
What are the ways that you felt it was prescient?
Well, to quote the end of the afterword, it's all about telling the truth. If you expect the public to, I can read it to you.
Yeah, please.
If I planned on it, I'd be able to find it more quickly. Plus, I've written 4 afterwards for this book. but the very end of the afterward has always been the same. So this is probably too long to read the. I don't want to read a whole page. Just read a couple of graphs. So the final lesson, a simple one, yet one most difficult to execute, is that those who occupy positions of authority must lessen the panic that can alienate all within a society. Society cannot function if it is every man for himself. By definition, civilization cannot survive that. Those in authority must retain the public's trust. The way to do that is to distort nothing, to put the best face on nothing, to try to manipulate no one. Lincoln said that first and best. Leadership must make whatever horror exists concrete. Only then will people be able to break it apart. So, obviously, in the United States, we did not get the truth. In this case, because this virus, it's very dangerous, but it's not virulent in the way that 1918 was. So it's not creating that kind of panic. But in terms of containing it, minimizing the death toll, getting the public to go along, what has happened is, violated every single precept in there, and people are dying who otherwise would remain alive and healthy. Not only in this country, but elsewhere as well. And there are countries who've done it right, who've done a tremendous job. And in most countries, particularly in the developed world, have done a much better job than the United States, unfortunately.
What are examples of countries in 1918 who were the countries that did it best, and what did they do that we didn't do at the time?
Well, a totally different situation because of the war.
Yeah.
And the federal government, Woodrow Wilson never made a public statement, ever, about the 1918 pandemic. His focus was entirely on the war. And there was an infrastructure that had been created in 1918 because of the war. And the influenza pandemic just sort of slipped into that. And that existing infrastructure dictated how not only the federal government, but local and state governments and the press would behave. It wasn't because of the pandemic, but it had impacts. And the federal government, Wilson created something called the Committee for Public Information. And the architect of the committee said, there's nothing in experience that tells us truth is superior to falsehood. All that matters is, the impact of what you tell people. So he's saying right there, it's okay to lie as long as the lie helps the war effort. And there was also a law that punishable by 20 years in prison to, quote, utter, write, print, or publish any disloyal, profane, or scurrilous or abusive language by the former government of the United States, unquote. They sent a congressman to jail. Sentence a congressman is 10 years under that law. So this was the idea that any criticism was unpatriotic and hurt the war effort. And this was the context. The influenza arrives. So you have national public health leaders saying this is ordinary influenza by another name, which of course it wasn't. And it was very obvious it wasn't. You could die in 24 hours after the first symptoms. You could die with bleeding not only from your nose and mouth, but from your eyes and ears. Pretty scary symptoms. And because of this desire to keep morale up, this idea that telling the truth would hurt morale and hurt the war effort, local governments echoed the federal government. There was no Tony Fauci in 1918, certainly not on a national level. And local newspapers, instead of trying to print the truth, were complicit. There was plenty of fake news in 1918, but it came from the government and it was reprinted by the media. They did not do their job. So as a result, people died who might otherwise have protected themselves. And this time around, you do have Tony Fauci, and you do have the media reporting accurately about events, but you also have a president who didn't tell the American public the truth. And you had, Fox that was echoing that stuff. You have a lot of people who didn't take this seriously and still don't take it seriously. Very unfortunate.
Knowing what you know and knowing, having done this research and lived with this book for a long time, where were you thinking in, I don't know, late January through February of this year?
Well, I thought we were in for it. On January 30th, I wrote an op-ed that ran on January 30th or 31st in the Washington Post. The working title of that op-ed was, "This virus cannot be contained." Although I pulled my punches a little bit and changed that to a question saying, "Can it be contained?" Said probably not. But it was perfectly obvious to anybody who knew anything about viruses. I'm certainly not a virologist, but I know something about them. You look what's going on in China, and it's going to act. They close a city of 11 million people down. They shut down a third of the country, and it had already escaped. You knew it had already escaped China long since. So you knew it had to be serious, and you knew it had to get around the world. It's funny. I've gotten a lot of national and, for that matter, international. In fact, just before this, taped this, I was being interviewed by a Spanish journalist. I've gotten a lot of attention since this, but it was so obvious. It's a little frustrating, but that was right in the middle of the impeachment. And I was surprised. I really expected that op-ed to get a lot of attention. Nobody called me about it. Not a single person, not a single producer for any of the cable shows. But it was, again, right in the middle of impeachment. So that ate up all the news, and I guess may have had some impact on Trump's thinking, but who knows what. I shouldn't speculate on that. I certainly never met the man.
So it looks like as we're talking, we have a new president-elect, but who won't take office for another 75 days. What are your fears about this? How this goes in this interim?
Well, I hope it goes better. I know that Biden has a plan. I know his experience in 2009. I was in fairly regular contact with the White House in 2009 during that pandemic. And in turn, trying to provide information more than anything else. Actually, scientists from around the world were emailing me with data that was not publicly available, or their governments weren't sharing it with the United States. So I was actually served as a back channel. And I know Ron Klain, who will probably be White House Chief of Staff. I think he's very capable. They are developing and have already developed a plan. My guess would be that Biden would lay that plan out well before the inauguration and try to get people to pay attention to it. You know, the president-elect does have some power in terms of the bully pulpit. And in this case, his message is going to be entirely consistent with the public health advice of every professional from the Trump administration. This would be Tony Fauci, you know, Redfield, you know, Deborah Birx. They're all saying the same thing. And maybe with the incoming president marrying the same message that's coming out of even the Trump administration people, you know, maybe it'll have some impact. I don't know. You know, we've actually done pretty well in Louisiana. As we're speaking, I hope it remains the case. We've actually escaped this tremendous surge that seems to be occurring in practically every other state in the country. So I think the governor has done a very good job in difficult circumstances. I think the mayor of New Orleans, remember New Orleans at one point had the highest growth rate in the world of fastest growth in news cases. I think she's done a very good job. So,
you know, we're seeing in the analysis of some of these election returns that some of that the areas where COVID outbreaks and deaths were the highest were also places where Trump did the best. Does that surprise you? Do you have any thoughts on why that is?
Well, you know, part of it is, you know, may have convinced people that it's not that important. Part of it is his message about the economy. I mean, we all want to go back to normal. You know, the fundamental mistake that his administration has made, and I think if he had done a better job with COVID, he'd have been reelected. He shot himself not in the foot, somewhere between the kneecap and his head, because he could have, you know, close as it is, I think he would have rolled to reelection if he had done a good job with COVID. But the fundamental mistake he made, and his administration has made, is seeing public health and the economy as fighting each other. They're not antagonists. If you want people to go into a movie theater and fill a movie theater, they're not going to do it if they're afraid they're going to get sick and die. If you take care of the virus, then you can fill the movie theater. The same thing for inside a restaurant. You can't get people, or at least the kinds of numbers that a restaurant needs, inside a restaurant if people think they're going to get sick. So, you know, the way to get that back is to take care of the virus. Australia, they've done it. They have 40,000 people at a sports event in Australia. Everything's open practically in Australia. They've taken care of it. South Korea, they've taken care of it. You know, Germany is surging now like the rest of Europe, but they've still done a much, much better job than the United States. Anyway.
Yeah. So the book that you're working on now on the current pandemic, what's your approach? Or is this a TikTok, or is this how are you approaching the telling
No,
the story?
I'm not. I'm going to take my time. The deadline's in 3 years, and I hope to meet it. Both my publisher and I expect there will be many books that are published prior to mine. So I'll let them do most of the TikTok. I told my publisher I'd try to use them as research assistants because I can't compete with them. You know, I'm sure the journalism has been terrific, and you know I can't compete with that. Nor am I going to try. But I think you know I have a little bit different perspective, and I do know almost all the players, not all of them, but I know many of the players, several people who were on the task force. And, both the, I mean, I've given talks at CDC and, some of the best virology labs in the country that, they know me, I know them. So again, I think there'll be a lot of science in it. And, plenty of politics. I wrote an op-ed a couple of weeks ago, said, when you mix science and politics, you get politics. So there'll be plenty of politics, but I'll probably have more science in it than the other books. Certainly the narrative will be there. Also a narrative about how people outside the administration have tried to influence policy. I mean, a lot of the people you see on TV commenting are, at least some of them are pretty good friends. And, many of the others, we know each other. There has almost been a shadow public health community trying to move the public in the right direction without, frankly, a lot of success. It's hard to overcome a president who's not telling you the truth.
So, John, tell us about the book that you've set aside for a time while you're working on this one. Is you said a book about the Louisiana coast. What's your approach to that, to telling that story?
Well, it was everything that's gone into making it a disaster. As I said, it starts with the Missouri River, where the sediment comes. A lot of the sediment, probably most of the sediment historically that came down the river came from the Missouri, and still a lot of it. A lot of that sediment has disappeared because of the construction of dams on the Missouri River. So that's one of the factors. Another factor is the construction of the Gulf and Intracoastal Waterway. Another factor is the construction of the levee system, of course. And another factor is, no doubt about it, the oil and gas industry. That and certainly there's some natural faulting. So I look at the stories of the construction of the dams, which I hope is fairly interesting. The construction of the GIWW. That's also, so it's about money and politics and how people get things done, unintended consequences. And certainly the attempt to get the oil and gas industry to rectify the damage that it did is part of the story. And, that's a part that I've never written in the first person. I really don't like first person stories. And I hate journalists when they say, as so-and-so told me, as if there's some intimate, of the principle. But in this case, part of the book will be in the first person as to, how I got the idea of the lawsuit and the whole story of that lawsuit. But it goes beyond that because, of course, there have been other lawsuits filed that I have absolutely no part of whatsoever. And all those things remain to be seen how they play out.
To talk for just a minute about your, how you balance, during this time that you were serving on the Flood Protection Authority and presiding over this lawsuit, how you balanced your role as a historian, a writer, but then someone who was actively working in the government / political realm.
Well, almost the entire time I was on the levee board, I was writing the Roger Williams, the book about church and state in the 17th century. And, John Winthrop, the person who actually said we were sitting on a hill, one of the most famous phrases in American history now, although made famous largely by Reagan, who added the adjective shining city on a hill, which was not Winthrop. He's, as you know, as a writer, you generally try to avoid adjectives. Nouns and verbs are better. But anyway, that certainly was not a full-time job. I mean, you do it for, well, technically you get a per diem for, 1 day a month, $100 some a day. So you can't live on that, So I felt somewhat obligated to be on the board. A lot of people asked me to apply for that when that board was created. And actually on the last deadline, the day I did, I thought that was an extraordinary board. It was when I was on it. I think it's deteriorated significantly since, unfortunately. I mean, it really was an all-star board. We had a past president of the American Society of Civil Engineers. We had the chairman of a National Academy of Sciences working group on coastal risk reduction. He's from North Carolina. We had the chief engineer, someone who had been the chief engineer for the state of California's 1,500 miles of levees, who also was their chief of floodplain management from California. We had someone who wrote college texts in engineering. We had practicing engineers. I mean, this was really an all-star board right after the storm. And it was a privilege to be on it, and it was very interesting to me. I thought what I could add to that board, and the reason I thought I would be useful, was number one, our battle was partly in Washington. It wasn't all against the river. And I did have access to the national media that other people on the board didn't have. I knew a lot of the reporters who covered Katrina and the aftermath, so I could call them up and maybe get things printed and could write op-eds. And I also knew a lot of the political players. For example, after Hastert said, let's bulldoze New Orleans, I figured, how do you respond to that? So I knew Newt Gingrich from my days as a political reporter. And for my first book, he was a major player in my first book. So I got Newt to agree to co-author an op-ed that ran in Time magazine for me. And he also was very helpful behind the scenes in passing legislation to share offshore revenues. So I knew a lot of the players in Washington. This is, almost 20 years ago now, 15 years ago. Most of those people were gone, so I'm not that. But I thought I could have some impact in Washington. And when you go up there to see a Congress, then you can always see the congressman from your state. That's not a problem. But I was able to see congressmen from other states because they knew Rising Tide. And actually, the influenza book also gave me a lot of access, because exactly the same people who take care of something like a pandemic on the Homeland Security Council or National Security Council, which was merged under Obama, they were the same people who, whether it was a pandemic or Katrina, a hurricane. So I knew them because of the influenza book, because of my involvement there. And, I helped in the Bush administration conceptualizing their pandemic preparedness plan. And it was very useful. For example, I did brief some very, very senior people in the White House once. And we subsequently had a problem with the Coast Guard down here on the levee board. They weren't being very responsive to us. I called this guy in the National Security Council, and what a surprise, all of a sudden the Coast Guard was very happy to talk to us. So I tried to apply what little leverage I had to help the situation down here. Then of course, it was obvious to everybody. Everybody knows it, that the industry had some impact on the coast. Even their own studies concede that they are responsible for roughly 1/3 the coastal land loss, and other studies, including one by the state, puts their percentage much, much higher than that. So I thought, why don't we try to get them to play a role in helping to solve a problem that they certainly helped create, and which also benefits them. I mean, they're all in favor of coastal restoration because it protects their pipelines and refineries. Anyway, I did have the idea for the lawsuit. The rest of the board was very supportive of that. We were unanimous, in fact. Nobody ever pushed back internally.
So we've kind of come to the end of our allotted hour, but I want to end by asking you if there's a young aspiring writer out there watching this who's looking for some inspiration. What advice would you give to a young person who wants to follow in your footsteps?
Well, it's kind of trite. Everybody says follow your passion. But I believe in that. So follow your passion.
Just do it.
It's hard. It's become a lot harder now than it was. It's certainly harder. I'm old enough and have been successful enough, but believe me, the success came pretty late in my life, that I can still operate on the old model. I can go to a publisher and get them to pay a pretty decent amount of money for a book idea if they like it. They don't always necessarily like it from me or anybody else. But if you're a young writer, that is tough right now. That is tough. Particularly since so many writers support themselves as waiters and things like that. You're not getting a lot of income waiting tables in a restaurant these days. So, I mean, the whole social media blogging, that's not me. I know that a lot of young writers use those tools and are very effective. It's sort of a learning curve thing with me. I never seem to have the time to learn how to exploit those avenues of communication. You probably do. But I haven't taken the time to learn. I probably should. Maybe that's an avenue for some people. But just go back to the basics. You follow your passion. I guess one thing that might be a little bit different from my experience than others is that, 2 books did get me involved directly in policy, and we've talked about them. One was Rising Tide, led to me being on the levee board, and obviously, the lawsuit and so forth. That was never part of my plan. And the second book was Influenza, which similarly got me involved in policy with, both the Bush and Obama administrations, not with this administration. And that was not part of the plan either. In both instances, people came to me after it. I found it intellectually interesting for the influenza stuff, and I've always, I guess, liked politics, so also felt some obligation. I guess that's relatively unusual for a writer. I certainly consider myself a writer first, above anything. But, you know,
Good advice.
ending with a whimper rather than.
John, thank you for indulging some of these questions of mine, and I just want to say that you're a Louisiana treasure. I'm really proud to know you, and I'm a big fan of you and your writing, and also your public service to the state and the way that you've contributed in other ways. And so I just really admire you in every way, and I want to just say again how happy I am that you're the Louisiana Writer of the Year.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That's very kind of you to say, and I read your column all the time. And I wasn't born in Louisiana, but it's certainly my home now. There's no question about it.
Well, we're proud to call you a Louisianian.
Okay.
Be well.
You too.